Namaste and good morning to all of you. Let's start the class with prayers. Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwaraha, Guru Sakshat Parbrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Om Bhu Bhavaswaha, Tatsavitra Varenayam, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, Diyo Yo Nah Prachodayat, Asto Ma Satgamya, Tamso Ma Jyotirgamya, Mrityorma Amritam Gamya. ओम सहनावतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सवीर्यं करवावहि तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहि ओम शांति 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 Okay, in Tuesday's class we are reading Mahabharata, and last time we saw that how Arjun and Subhadra is Lord Krishna's sister. So they got married, Gandharva Vivaha. So, but Lord Krishna wants them to come back to Dwarka and do the wedding properly also, with all the rituals. So this is what we are going to see over here in this chapter. And the title of this chapter is Draupadi's Anger. The next day, Arjun and Subhadra rode back into the ocean city to a warm welcome. Balram had forgotten his anger and greeted Arjun with a huge embrace. The Yadav bowed elaborately, crying, "Bless me, Swami. We are honored you have returned to our midst." The Kalyan Mandap for the wedding had been erected on the outer walls of Dwarka, and the sea smashed against them 100 hands below. With solemn ceremony, Subhadra, princess of the Yadavas, was married to Arjun the Pandav. Krishna joked to his cousins, but out of Balram's hearing, that it was amazing indeed to see a couple marry twice in 2 days, and once after they had spent a night together. You remember they got married, Gandharva Vivaha, and now they got married again. But the people of Dwarka were overjoyed to have their princess married to the Kshatriya, who was such a legend among them. It was a romance unparalleled, since their own Krishna carried Rukmani away on the day she was to marry Shishupal. The Yadavas were pleased at the new bond with the sons of Kunti, who was after all one of them, Vrishni herself. This marriage would bring fortune to both kingdoms, and the sons born to Arjun and Subhadra would be magnificent Kshatriyas. Arjun remained in Dwarka for a year after he married Subhadra. When the year was over and the only one last 12 months remained of his exile, you remember he was on an exile for 12 years. He felt the need to return to the wilds and live in solitude once more. Since his exile was a punishment as well, he thought he should spend its final months away from the luxury of palace life in Dwarka and the Yadav's lavish hospitality. A year in the forest would also prepare Subhadra for her new life in Indraprastha. Subhadra and Arjun were in love. The time they spent in a little ashram in Pushkar, which is sacred to Lord Brahma, passed like a dream. A year flew by and it was time to return to Indraprastha. Arjun thought of Draupadi, and he feared her anger when he took Subhadra home. Though Panchali had 5 husbands, she had never forgotten which Pandav won her at her Swamba. The one who had shot the spinning fish, just a shade more than the others, always Draupadi loved Arjun, and she was possessive of him. It was the end of spring when Arjun rode into Indraprastha with Subhadra. They had worn simple, rustic clothes in Pushkar to go unnoticed, and were now dressed as a gypsy, cowherd, and his wife. Yudhishthir, Bhim, Nakul, and Sahadev came to the palace steps to receive them. Arjun, cried Yudhishthir, and raised him up when he knelt at his feet. Tears in his eyes, the king embraced his brother. Then Subhadra knelt before him. Yudhishthir blessed her a little awkwardly. Meanwhile, Bhim enfolded Arjun in a hug and would not release his brother. How would we have missed you? Cried the Titan. And here you are at last, and come home with such a lovely wife. Bhim whispered to Arjun, you had better be warned. Panchali is beside herself with jealousy. Then the twins were hugging their brother. Sahadev cried, but don't wait here any longer. Mother is impatient to see you, and Draupadi too, though she has been in a black mood since she heard you married Subhadra. Nakul said, we have word from Dwarka. Krishna and Balram are coming here soon. Arjun took Subhadra into Kunti's apartment. His mother had been waiting. She rose with a cry and he fell at her feet. She raised him up and clasped him to her. Then she asked, where is she? Where is my little niece? Subhadra had never seen her aunt, and now she had become her daughter in law. Shyly, she entered the room, still wearing her Gopika's clothes. Kunti hugged her as if she was her own daughter. She made her sit beside her and gave her the silks and jewels and all the special things she had kept for her since she heard the news. Kunti kissed Subhadra again and again, crying, how lovely she is, a jewel from the sea. Then she was grave and called Arjun to sit near her. Kunti said softly, as if she was afraid she might be overheard. Panchali has been angry since she heard. She hardly eats or speaks to anyone. You must be tactful with her. She imagines the worst, especially since Subhadra is your cousin. Arjun blanched. Kunti went on. It is fortunate you are fair, my child, or she would have compared herself to you. But Panchali is noble. She is only angry because she has never seen this girl like a bit of the moon. Draupadi grew in a house where she was constantly told she was the most beautiful woman in the world, and now she has 5 husbands who tell her the same thing. Perhaps it is time she met an equal, but go humbly to her. Subhadra, everything depends on your first meeting. Go dressed as you are, as a gypsy rather than a princess. She will find it easier to accept you. Kunti frowned. Everything depends on her liking you at first sight. Everything. I think I should go alone to her first, said Arjun. Yes, but don't expect any welcome. This will not come until she has seen Subhadra. But as you say, you had better see her first. His heart in his mouth, Arjun came to Draupadi's apartment. The door was ajar, and he walked in. She sat near a window, drying her long hair in the sun that fell in on her. She sat with her back to him, unraveling the knots in her tresses with fine dark fingers, and she was more bewitching than ever. He felt the familiar tautness in his stomach. He stood gazing at her. For a long moment, Arjun let a swirl of feelings overwhelm him as he stood silently staring. She was not aware of him yet. Then he coughed softly. Draupadi spun around and the smile froze on Arjun's face. Her eyes were red with crying, her face puffy without sleep. She rose slowly, very regally, and she was breathing hard. He took a step towards her. Panchali, her eyes flashed at him. He saw she was trembling, and she said in a terrible voice, why have you left her for even a moment? I don't need your pity. Go where your heart is. When you tie a second knot, the first one is loosened. She stood there, her face pale, her lips twitching. Arjun said, I am where my heart is. But she cried, leave me alone, ran into the next room, and slammed the door. Tears in his eyes, Arjun went back to his mother's apartment. Kunti said, she's angry, isn't she? It will pass. If she likes Subhadra, everything will go all right. You must go humbly to her, little one. When she sees how lovely you are, she will forgive Arjun. Arjun's hands were clammy. He was far from sure that it would be as easy as his mother thought. Yet they must try, and Subhadra, who was no less noble than Draupadi, was not reluctant to placate her, as any other princess would have been. At least Panchali would know the younger woman did not want to threaten her position as queen of Indraprastha. Arjun sighed. The only way is for you to go to her. Subhadra rose and went bravely with the maid Kunti called to show her the way. The Sakhi took her to Draupadi's door and then waited nervously for the princess to enter by herself. With a smile, Subhadra walked in. This was her life now, and she knew she had to win Draupadi over. Draupadi was not in the room where Arjun had seen her, and the inner door still stood shut. With a silent prayer, thinking of Krishan, Subhadra knocked on it. There was silence from within. She waited a moment, then knocked again. A voice in which there were tears demanded, "Who is it?" "Krishan's sister." "May I come in?" Another silence, then Draupadi asked, "Are you alone?" Yes. Subhadra knew the other woman must have been frantically setting her appearance right. Another long moment passed, and then Draupadi opened the door and stood dark and awesomely beautiful before Subhadra. Subhadra gasped when she saw Panchali, and her eyes clearly showed what she felt. She smiled sweetly and said, "I am Subhadra, and I want to be your Sakhi." Then she added quite spontaneously, "You are even more beautiful than I had heard." Draupadi stared at Subhadra for a probing moment. At last, the ghost of a smile dawned on her lips. She said, "And so are you." Then Draupadi held her arms open. Subhadra came to her, and next moment Panchali was kissing her and crying, "You are so exquisite. I can't resist you myself." Then how could poor Arjun? She took the younger woman's hand and led her into her bedroom. An hour later, Arjun came anxiously to Draupadi's apartment, worried that she may have been as savage with Subhadra as she had been with him. He found Subhadra wearing a priceless sari in crimson silk and Draupadi's most treasured jewelry. The two women sat chatting and laughing together like sisters. Arjun stood astonished at the door. Draupadi saw him and fell silent, casting her eyes down. Subhadra turned and saw him. She whispered to Draupadi and, brushing past Arjun, went out, shutting the door behind her. The blood pounded in Arjun's body to be alone with dark Panchali after so long. She too had waited impatiently for him, determined to fight for her place as his first wife, and equally resolved to give in if she saw no other way. Now she had no battle with Subhadra. After a moment's silence, she rose with a soft cry. She was in his arms. Her hands were on him in a familiar frenzy that they had both lived without for 12 long years. The Yadavas come to Indraprastha. A few days later, Balram, Krishan, their wives, and a company of Yadavas arrived in Indraprastha. Nakul and Sahadev came to the gates to receive them. The people of Indraprastha flocked into the streets to welcome the one who had raised their city in the wilderness. Of course, now that city was many times as populous as it had been when Krishan was last here, 12 years ago. Many of the Kurus had never seen the Dark One about whom they had heard so much, who lived in legendary Dwarka on the sea and whom the world called the Avatar. The women of Indraprastha were excited. They crowded the balconies and rooftops and showered wild rose petals on him as he rode by in his chariot, waving to them. The women saw he was handsomer than they had dreamt and even more mysterious. They favored him with sultry glances and inviting smiles. Even shy housewives were strangely overcome. He smiled at them, and the men of Indraprastha never noticed the intimate exchange. At the palace, Yudhishthir, Bhim, and Arjun waited on the shining steps. Yudhishthir ran to Krishna like a child and embraced him, and then Bhim and Arjun. Balram was warmly welcomed. Bhim especially was pleased his master had come. Ceremoniously, Balram gave the gold and the ornaments seldom seen in the world, the 1,000 chariots, the 1,000 horses, and the 1,000 virgins, all of which they had brought as Subhadra's dowry to Yudhishthir. Inside the palace, Kunti was waiting for them with Draupadi and Subhadra herself, looking radiantly happy. When they all sat together, Yudhishthir said, "I hope you have come to stay with us for some time." Balram replied, "10 days we shall spend together, Yudhishthir, and may they be joyful. But after that I must return home and the others with me." There were protests from the Pandavas. Why only 10 days after coming all the way from the Dwarka? Balram held up his hand. Let me finish, cousins. We Yadavas also have enemies we must fear, and our women and children are at home. It would be dangerous to leave Dwarka unprotected for more than 10 days. If word goes abroad, abroad that Krishna and I are away, there are those that will seize their chance to attack our city. He paused. But Krishna can remain here with you as long as he likes. The Pandavs' faces lit up. A delighted Yudhishthir said, You can't imagine how pleased I am. Merry as always, Krishna replied. I am happy to stay, Yudhishthir. He glanced at Arjun and added cryptically, These are momentous times, and your city is the eye of the coming storm. When they pressed him to explain, he would only say, Everything will be made plain in good time, for time reveals all things to all men. Now we are hungry after our journey. We hear the cooks of Indraprastha are the finest in the world and wonder if they deserve their reputation. Bhim sniffed the air and cried, Food is served. Arm in arm, and all of them except Krishna, quite innocent of what the future held, they went into the banquet prepared by the gifted cooks of Indraprastha's palace. Bhim had lured these men away from Hastinapur and almost every other kingdom. He wanted the cuisine to be exceptional and eclectic, and to please any guest that came to their city, even from the remotest corner of Bharatvarsh. Krishna and Balram were seated at the head of the king's table and served in golden and silver dishes. The fare was every bit as delectable as reputed. Bhim glowed when he saw how his guests enjoyed the meal, and he made a point of asking each Yadav if he liked the food. Bhim's appetite for compliments was, was an insatiable as it was for the food itself. 10 days of swimming in the sparkling pools of Indraprastha, hunting in the forests around the city, feasts every evening supervised by the son of the wind, marvelous entertainment every night in the halls of the palace and the open, music and dancing in courtyards where fountains splashed under the moon and the stars. 10 perfect days and nights flashed by, and too quickly it was time for Balram to return to Dwarka. Yudhishthir and Bhim came to the older Yadav and pleased with him to stay, and they were so keen, and the Balram was having such an excellent time, and that when Krishna added his voice to theirs, his brother was persuaded to remain for another fortnight. But at the end of those 14 days, it was time to go back. Balram set out for Dwarka, leaving Krishna behind with Yudhishthir and his brothers. Colorful flags waving and 1,000 conches booming under the sky, the force from Dwarka set out for home, flowing over the land like another great river, with Balram at its head and the legion of Yadav heroes behind him. The Hungry Brahman. Summer came once more to Bharatvarsh, and the heat was intolerable. In Indraprastha, Krishna and Arjuna were to be found in each other's company. The avatar and the bhagat. From dawn until late into the night, they would sit drinking and talking, or at times enfolded in a shared silence, not needing words to commune. Often they hunted together for boar and deer in the woods near the city. Early one morning, Arjun came to Krishna's room. Shall we go to the river today and spend a day in the Khandav one? They say the forest is cooler than anywhere else. Krishna was enthusiastic. I have heard so much about the Khandav. I haven't been on the banks of the Yamuna for years, and I grew up beside her. They set out within the hour. The party included Draupadi, Subhadra, and Satyabhama, Bhim, and the twins, other members of the family, the palace cooks, and a cart full of provisions and vessels for them to ply their craft. They journeyed leisurely through the comfortable warmth of the early morning. As the heat of the day began to grow fierce, they saw a forbidding jungle loomed ahead. Its old trees reaching for the sky with the dark arms and fingers of branch and leaf. Subhadra shivered. What an evil place it seems. Draupadi said, I hope we won't be going too deep into the jungle. Arjun laughed. Not you, certainly. The Khandav is no place for women. But after we have eaten, Krishan and I may explore it for a while. Krishan said, but let us get to the first trees, for this heat will be the end of us. The sun beat down, and they now drove their chariots hard to find shade. Suddenly, Sahadev, riding in the van of the party, shouted, look, the Yamuna. Meandering into the dim forest was the midnight blue river. Krishan gave a cry and forged ahead of the others and came first to the river. As if meeting an old friend, even an old love, he knelt beside the Yamuna and, excited as a child, began to speak to her. He not only spoke, but craned to listen to her smoky water, as if she whispered back to him, and he knew her fluid tongue. The others arrived to find him under a kadamba tree whose branches grew out over the water, and a deep wistfulness had come over him. He sat lost in his mood. Satyabhama came and sat briefly beside him, but she saw he would rather be alone and went back to Draupadi and Subhadra. The servants cleared some level ground near the river and set up tents. The food carts were unloaded, and the cooks were soon at their fires. The Kuru men stripped off their clothes and plunged into the cool water. The women also had come prepared. They went off a short way with their sakhis, and they too swam in the caressing flow. Krishan sat plunged in a reverie. The Yamuna beside him had loosed a flood of memories from his boyhood. This river was a part of him, a part of his earliest, happiest years. In his mind's eye now, he saw his father Nand's house of logs built on the hem of another deep jungle along the Yamuna's course, the Vrindavan. He saw the gypsy cohorts, crescent-shaped settlement, enchanted by the Yamuna. Krishna was borne back to those green days when he roamed the jungle and the river bank, wild himself, a friend to deer and tiger, jackal and elephant, and all the free creatures of the earth. He saw his mother Yashoda at her hearth. He thought she turned and smiled at him. He had not had the heart to say farewell to her when he left Vrindavan all those years ago, left so suddenly for Mathura. His mind turned another corner in the precious maze of memory, and now he was not a boy anymore, but a dark youth, irresistible. He saw himself in the heart of Vrindavan, in a hidden glade full of jasmine, fragrant as heaven. He was not alone there, but with she who was as lovely as the forest in spring. Krishna saw her face. The pain he thought he had grown out of was still sharp. Thinking of Radha again, today beside the darkling river, Krishna's heart filled with ecstatic memories of stolen hours of forbidden love in the forest. When a throbbing moon bathed the trees in silvery magic, he had never loved anyone else as he had her. He knew he would never see her again in this life. It was a curse he carried. He saw her face, her naked body filmed in dew, lying beside him on Vrindavan's velvet grasses. He could hardly bear the anguish or wait for everything he had come for to be over and his life to end. He felt her presence so clearly under the kadam tree. Radha waited for him across the threshold of death. At last, Krishna tore himself away from his dream of the sweet, irretrievable past. He joined the others in the river, and he was himself again, full of high spirits. He challenged Bhim to race across the Yamuna and beat him by lengths. The cooks announced food. They had laid on a banquet in the wilds because Bhim would have no less. Everything tasted so fresh out in the open, and after a vigorous swim, they all ate more than they should. When the meal was over, the cool tents beckoned. The sun was overhead now, and the heat fiercer than ever on a full stomach. The Kshatriyas and their women retired to the tents and quickly fell asleep. Krishna said to Arjun, let's explore the one. The two of them set off into the towering, ominous jungle. As they went along, the trees grew closer together and their branches intertwined like so many lured spirits embracing. They felt this forest was a single, somehow terrible being. Soon, hardly any light penetrated the thick awning above. And Krishna and Arjun sensed sinister presences all around them and an aura of implacable evil. The air was still. Dank vapors hung heavy. No breath of breeze had stirred here for years. This jungle was the home of many malignant creatures and fell spirits that had lived here through the ages, their malevolence spreading through the earth. It was a forest of ghouls and demons. Arjun shivered. I feel suffocated. Let us find the river. They struck out again towards the Yamuna and quite abruptly emerged from the breathless, perpetual night of the Khandav into a bright glade where the dense growth of trees parted to let the blue river flow through. Here the meshed roof of branches was broken, and the summer sun lay upon the clear water. Krishna and Arjun sighed in relief. Back in the darkness, they had felt countless leering phantoms crowding them, probing them, stroking their very souls with obscene fingers. They saw a large panag tree growing beside the river. Great roots curled above the ground, and the cousins sat in its shade beside the surcent Yamuna. They sat in silence, listening to the river murmuring along. Here in the open, the day was warm again, and the two Kshatriyas drifted off into a light slumber. They had hardly dozed for half an hour when, aroused by a sharp instinct, both of them awoke together. They saw the strangest being standing before them. He was as tall as a sal tree, and he was a Brahman, but such an extraordinary Brahman. His bare body glistened like molten gold in the sunlight. His eyes, long as lotus petals, were red as flame hearts, and so were his flowing hair and beard tinged green. He had matted locks and wore rags, but glowed as if a fire burned inside him. Krishna and Arjun rose and folded their hands to the uncanny one. He stared back at them, breathing heavily, his eyes like sunsets. Krishna said calmly as ever, Greetings, Brahman. How may we serve you? In an exceptional voice, as if 100 wood fires crackled in his throat, the Brahman said, I am hungry. Arjun said innocently, Our cooks will make anything you want to eat. The Brahman looked at him for a moment as he might at an imbecile child. My hunger is not easily appeased. I am Agni. I want to devour this accursed Khanda one with all its evil birds and beasts, trees and plants, spirits, serpents and demons. I know who you are, and I have been waiting for you. You are the ones to help me. How is that, O Agni? Asked Krishna. I have my reasons for wanting to devour the Khanda, and the will of the world is one of them. For centuries I have longed to burn this one, but Takshak, the serpent king, lives in the heart of the Khanda, and he is Indra's friend. Whenever I send my tongues aflame to lick up the jungle, Indra unleashes a thunderstorm to put out my fire. Many times this has happened, and I have no answer to Indra's torrents. I know you two are masters of the Devastras. This jungle is a seething nest of evil. You must help me exorcise it. The monsters that breed in the darkness of the Khanda are abominations upon the earth. Long ago, this was a pure and taintless forest, but for thousands of years now, its heart has turned to darkness. There is only one way to end the breeding night that thrives under its canopy. canopy. To burn it down, if your astras can hold off Indra's rain, I will raise the jungle in a day and satisfy my hunger, which feeds on me that it cannot feed on the one. I ask you this favor, and I will give you anything in return. They were astonished to hear what the fire god wanted. With a laugh, Krishna cried, We will help you, Agni, but first we need some weapons and a chariot. Arjun said, We have astras and we can hold off Indra's rain. But Dev, I have no bow to loose the astras I command. I have no quivers, and my chariot and horses are too slow for your task. Arjun was certain the advent of Agni was also a pretext for him to receive a gift of weapons from the god of fire. Agni turned to Krishna. Tell me the weapons you want. The dark one murmured, A chakra would serve me well. Agni bowed gravely to both of them. He folded his hands to the west in the direction of the ocean. He shut his eyes and began to chant some words in a divine language that Arjun did not know and Krishna had not heard in this lifetime. But the avatar understood it. Agni stood rapt, and the arcane mantra flowed resonantly from him. The Yamuna paused to hear it. Then another sound arose, as of waves crashing against a rocky shore. For a moment they thought the river had risen, but then a great, fluent luster shone there. Light in rippling waves, light in a crystal tide. Another Dev stood before Agni, as tall and unearthly as himself. His body was translucent, his hair seemed to be flowing water, every strand a river. His raiment was of moss, lichen, and colorful plants that grow in ocean deeps. He wore incredible pearls and corals, carried a trident in his hand, and 1,000 brilliant fish clung to him in adoration. He seemed to be in this world and another at once. The two guards greeted each other in the tongue in which Agni had summoned Varun. Lord of oceans and keeper of the pristine weapons of the earth, Varun bowed to Krishna and Arjun, who bowed back to him, quite wonderstruck. In his voice of tides, Varun said, after an age, my friend Agni has called me with the Samudra mantra. It must be a task of destiny he summons me for. Agni said, you know how long I have wanted to consume the Khandav one, but Indra has always prevented me. These Kshatriyas are Arjun and Krishna, whom we know of. They have promised to help me, but they have no weapons with which to contain Indra. You have Som Dev's Ayuds, given to you when the earth was young. Let these warriors have the moon's weapons and a chariot swift as the mind. Varun said, I have brought them. I knew the time had come, and the Kshatriyas may keep the weapons for the span of their mortal lives, after which they must be returned to me. What have you brought? Called Agni. Varun made a mystic mudra, and another supernatural light shone there. The river seemed to become part of another world. The ocean god said, look, an incandescent chariot materialized at the heart of the light. 4 horses were yoked to it, whiter than the snow on Kailash, their manes like moonlight. They tossed their long heads and whinnied. On the chariot's golden banner flew a legendary flag with the image of a hero from an ancient race that had vanished from the jungles of Bharatvarsh, Chiranjeevi Hanuman, the immortal Vanar, Bhagat of Shri Ram of old. This same chariot, in time out of mind, had helped the Devas win their very first war against the Asurs. It stood there, pulsing with life, bright as a new cloud lit by the rising sun. Varun led them to the Rath, and Arjun drew a sharp breath on the chariot seat, lay a golden bow encrusted with jewels. It was a prodigious weapon, and Arjun was sure he saw it breathe. The Pandav had the strangest feeling that the Ayudh recognized him. Varun opened his arms like a sea parting to that primeval weapon. He said simply, Gandhiv. They gasped at that name. Who had not heard of the legendary Gandhiv? It was the moon's bow, which Brahma had wrought before the earth was made and given to Somdev, his favorite son. No warrior who wielded the golden bow could be vanquished in battle. Beside the Gandhiv lay 2 silver quivers that shimmered so delicately they seemed to be made of moon beams. These were the moon god's inexhaustible quivers. The arrows that welled from them were as numerous as water drops in the sea. The oceans of the earth would dry up before these quivers were empty. By now, Arjun was melting in gratitude. He bowed to Varun and Agni and made a solemn pradakshina around the chariot. At last, he picked up the weapon that lay in it. It was alive in his hands. It spoke to his deepest heart, and the Pandav felt a tremor of exhilaration. He strapped on the quivers, light as wishes, at once. They were full of shining arrows. Arjun prostrated himself before Varun and Agni. They blessed him, and as he rose, Varun vanished. His hands shaking for joy, what greater prize could any Kshatriya have than this bow? Arjun gingerly strung the gandeev. As soon as he stretched the string from one tip to the other, the weapon rumbled like a cloud full of spring thunder. The Pandav's heart sang to hear that sound. When he had fastened the string, he pulled on it, and the tremendous twanging made the earth quake under their feet. Arjun threw back his head and laughed in absolute delight. Now Agni came up to Krishan. Something terribly bright lay in his flame like hands. An irradiant disk, Agni said, this belongs to you. I have only fetched it into the world. The Sudarshan Chakra, my lord. Krishan held out his hands, and Arjun saw the disk spin out of Agni's palms and into the dark ones. Krishan raised his right hand with his forefinger pointing at the sky. The chakra was so fine it might have had no thickness at all, but only one side, if such a thing could be. Now it flashed up and poised itself, a blinding wafer of light above Krishan's fingers. Krishan bowed to Agni, and when he folded his hands to the god of fire, the chakra disappeared from sight. Yet it was with the avatar now, in the world, and he could summon it when he chose. Krishna said, now we shall surely contain even Indra. Arjun climbed into the white chariot. Krishna climbed in beside him and took the reins. Arjun cried, we are ready, O Dev. Burn the forest as you will. Agni roared, and the Brahman was transformed into an immense figure of flames. Let's stop it here, and we'll see next time how that Khandav one got burned. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamev Avisheshyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you very much.